In a world that's supposed to be bound by the rules of equality, racism still thrives in the most shocking ways. Nia leaned back in her first-class seat, her tired body finally able to relax after a long, exhausting business trip. The hum of the plane's engines was a comforting lullaby, and the soft lighting of the cabin felt like a sanctuary from the chaos of her day. As the plane ascended, Nia closed her eyes for a moment, grateful for the brief respite before her next set of challenges. But just as the world outside seemed to blur into tranquility, a loud, shrill voice broke through her peace. "I want her arrested." The woman's voice was unmistakable. A middle-aged white woman in the row behind her, furious, pointing directly at Nia. "She's threatening me! This woman is causing trouble!" Nia blinked in disbelief. "What?" The flight attendants looked between the two women, their faces marked with confusion. Tension built in the air like a storm about to break. Nia, stunned, turned slightly in her seat. She had done nothing wrong. But why was this happening to her? The woman, her face flushed red with anger, didn't stop. And neither did the eyes of the passengers around them, all of them suddenly aware of the escalating situation. Before we dive deeper into Nia's unexpected fight for justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more powerful, real-life-inspired stories that challenge our perceptions. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in her shoes? The plane soared high above the clouds, traveling from New York to Los Angeles, a routine flight for Nia. She had just wrapped up a high-stakes business meeting and was looking forward to a quiet, uninterrupted journey home. Seated in first class, Nia exuded confidence. Her sharp suit, focused demeanor, and polished professionalism all spoke to the woman she had worked so hard to become. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she could never fully escape the weight of being a black woman in spaces that weren't always welcoming. Today, it felt different. There was something in the air, something almost suffocating. The plane cabin, typically a sanctuary of anonymity, seemed to shrink around her, an isolated microcosm of a world where a single moment of injustice could send ripples through everything. As Nia settled in, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight, like so many moments in her life, might soon challenge her in ways she never imagined. The murmur of voices, the clink of trays, and the soft hum of the plane's engines were all Nia could focus on as she tried to settle into her seat. She had barely closed her eyes when the voice came again, louder this time. "Excuse me," the woman behind her snapped. "This woman is disrupting me. I demand she be removed from this flight." Nia stiffened, confused. She hadn't moved an inch. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She hadn't done anything except sit in her seat, adjusting her posture for comfort. A flight attendant appeared, trying to mediate, but the woman wasn't done. "She's acting suspiciously," the Karen continued, her voice rising with each word. "She's a threat. I'm not going to sit next to her. She looks dangerous." Nia felt a sickening knot in her stomach as the flight attendant hesitated, unsure of how to handle the situation. The woman's accusations were absurd, but the volume of her voice seemed to demand action. The other passengers were turning to look, the tension growing palpable. The flight attendant's eyes flickered between Nia and the Karen, her face painted with indecision. Nia could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her. This wasn't just about one woman's bigotry. It was about the larger system that could, and often did, validate the claims of someone like the Karen. Nia's heart raced. This was happening again, but this time she wasn't going to let it slide. She would not shrink back into silence. "Why are you doing this?" Nia's voice was calm, but firm. "I haven't done anything to you." The flight attendant hovered nervously between the two women, her eyes darting from Nia to the Karen, as though waiting for someone to make the first move. Nia's mind raced, every ounce of her body on high alert. Her palms were sweaty, her heart thundering in her chest. "Please, calm down, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice strained. We'll try to resolve this situation. The Karen cut her off. Resolve it? I'm not sitting next to a criminal. You're not taking this seriously. Her voice grew louder with every word. She's a threat, and I demand she be arrested. Nia's throat tightened. She tried to remain calm, but her voice cracked as she spoke. I haven't done anything to you. Why are you doing this? Don't lie, the Karen hissed, her face flushed with fury. You're dangerous. I'm in fear for my life. She's probably one of those people who think they can just do whatever they want. Nia felt her pulse spike. Those people. The words stung more than they should have. She had heard them all her life. That deep, unspoken assumption that people like her didn't belong, didn't fit, didn't deserve the same respect as others. But here, in this confined space, with her fellow passengers watching, the words took on an entirely different weight. The flight attendant, caught between trying to de-escalate the situation and fearing the potential fallout of doing nothing, looked to Nia. Ma'am, we need to ask you to step aside so we can assess the situation. Please cooperate. Nia blinked in disbelief. Step aside. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was she about to be the one kicked off the flight? Was she about to become the criminal in this twisted narrative? The Karen's rant didn't stop. She continued to hurl insults at Nia, calling her a thug, a troublemaker, a disruptor of peace. Each word felt like a slap across her face. For a moment, Nia closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, trying to think clearly. But the heat of the moment, the rawness of the accusation, threatened to overwhelm her. What was she supposed to do? She had spent her entire life learning to navigate these situations, microaggressions, the subtle snubs, the looks of suspicion when she entered a room. But now, this wasn't subtle. This wasn't just a side glance or a condescending comment. This was full-blown accusation, and this time, there was no running from it. Nia felt an internal tug of war. Should she fight back, raise her voice and risk being thrown off the plane, or should she stay calm, keep her composure, and risk being falsely accused? The options seemed equally terrifying. Her mind flashed back to every time she had been dismissed, belittled, or ignored because of her race. Every time she'd been forced to play the good black woman card to avoid conflict, to stay respectable in the eyes of the world. But this time, she felt a simmering anger rise inside her. This time, the rules were different. This time, she would not be silenced. I'm not going anywhere, Nia said, her voice low but firm. She locked eyes with the flight attendant. If she's not removed from this flight for making false accusations, I'm staying right here. The Karen's face twisted with rage. You can't talk to me like that. I am a paying customer. You should be listening to me. Get her out of my face. Nia could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some looked on with pity, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. But there were a few, just a few, who met her gaze, their eyes full of quiet support. But even those who were silently on her side couldn't fully step in. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted into something tense, something dangerous. A few passengers whispered among themselves, eyes darting nervously between Nia and the Karen. It was as though they were afraid to get involved. Nia caught snippets of their conversations. She must have done something. Why is she being so combative? Another voice, barely a whisper. She looks like she's just trying to start something. The isolation she felt was sharp, biting. This wasn't just about one woman's hate. This was the world telling her that no matter how poised, how well-spoken, how much she had accomplished, there would always be someone who saw her as a threat. A dangerous black woman. Her body tensed as the flight attendants began to discuss the possibility of involving authorities. The Karen had demanded it, and now the crew seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. They were afraid of the consequences of doing nothing. But Nia knew, whatever they decided, this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. This was about race, about bias, and about how quickly the narrative could shift when the wrong person decided to play the victim. But Nia couldn't back down. She couldn't let this be another moment where she stayed silent. Let someone else's prejudices dictate her future. If I don't speak up now, what will happen next time? I'll be staying in my seat, Nia said again, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. I'm not going anywhere. The tension in the cabin was thick, and it felt like every second stretched on forever. Nia's mind spun, but she refused to let herself fall into fear. This wasn't just about the woman behind her. It was about standing her ground, about refusing to let this moment define her. The Karen's behavior grew more erratic by the minute. She began mocking Nia, calling her names like ghetto and violent, making exaggerated motions as if to show just how scared she was. The absurdity of it all made Nia's blood boil, but she held her ground. One of the flight attendants stepped forward and began to speak into a walkie-talkie, likely calling for airport security to meet them on the tarmac. The situation had escalated beyond their control, and in that moment, Nia knew. The only way this would end without her being unjustly taken off the plane was if she made her truth loud enough for everyone to hear. The woman in the seat next to her, an older woman who had been silent until now, leaned in, her voice soft but urgent. Don't let them push you off this flight. You've got this. Speak your truth. Don't let her win. Nia nodded slightly, taking a deep breath. She was done being silent. The eyes of the world were on her, but this was her moment. She turned towards the flight attendant. I need to speak to someone in charge when we land. This is unacceptable. The Karen seethed, but Nia knew this fight was just beginning, and she was ready to see it through. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the engines humming a rhythmic lullaby that contrasted sharply with the growing storm of tension within the cabin. Nia's heart raced, her mind on high alert, but she refused to look away from the woman behind her, who was still relentless in her accusations. The Karen, now practically frothing with rage, had escalated the situation to a new level of absurdity. I demand we land early, the Karen screamed, her voice cutting through the cabin like a knife. This woman is a danger. I'm not getting off this plane without a police report. I'll sue this airline if you don't remove her. Nia's chest tightened, the weight of the injustice bearing down on her. She felt the cold grip of fear in her gut, knowing that this wasn't just a threat. It was a real possibility. The flight attendants, caught between the Karen's threats and Nia's refusal to back down, looked visibly distressed. They were about to call for a detour to the nearest airport to appease the woman whose loud accusations could very well cause them to lose their job if they ignored them. But then, just as the atmosphere reached its boiling point, a calm voice cut through the noise. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to intervene here, a man's voice said from across the aisle. Nia turned to see a man in his late 40s standing, a slightly graying beard and glasses perched on his nose. He had the confident, composed air of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I'm a lawyer, he continued, and I think this situation is escalating unnecessarily. I'm willing to mediate if both women are willing to speak openly. The room fell silent for a moment. The Karen stopped her rant, eyeing the man with suspicion. Nia, though still bracing herself for the worst, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the chance to speak her truth. The flight attendants exchanged uncertain looks, and the captain, overhearing the conversation, sent a quick message to the crew at the front. They were nearing their landing, but the tension was palpable, and the situation had reached a critical point. There was no more time for indecision. The passengers had already begun to shift in their seats, many of them silently observing the spectacle unfold before them. Fine, the Karen huffed, her voice dripping with disdain. But if she starts making threats again, I'll have her arrested before we even land. The man, now standing at the front of the cabin, addressed the flight attendants. Let's allow both women to speak, in front of the passengers. Full transparency. If we do this with respect, there should be no further issues." The flight attendants nodded, although it was clear they were still uncertain about how to proceed. But they also seemed to realize that something needed to break this stalemate before the situation spiraled even further. The lawyer gestured for Nia to stand, and after a deep breath, she did. Every eye in the cabin was on her. Her stomach churned, but she squared her shoulders and looked around the room. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was standing up for every black woman who had ever been falsely accused, for every person who had ever been judged based on their appearance rather than their actions. She turned to the Karen first, her voice calm, though there was a slight tremor of emotion running through her words. "Here's what happened," Nia began, her tone clear and composed. "I've been sitting in my seat for the entire flight, minding my own business. Not a single word or action from me has caused any disruption to anyone. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't moved out of my seat. Yet I am being accused of something I didn't do. This woman," she gestured toward the Karen, "has decided that I am a threat based solely on how I look." The Karen sputtered, but Nia pressed on. "I'm not here to argue. But I'm here to say that these kinds of false accusations are not just dangerous. They are a reflection of a larger issue. This isn't about me or her. It's about how some people see someone who looks like me and immediately assume the worst. I will not accept being painted as something I'm not." She paused, her breath steadying. The tension in the cabin was thick, but Nia could sense the shift. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every unjustly accused person, for every moment she'd ever been silenced. The lawyer stepped forward then, his presence a steadying force. "Let's be clear here," he said, his voice measured and authoritative. "No one should be removed from this flight without due process. We can't let the loudest voice dictate the facts. The airline's crew has a responsibility to assess the situation impartially, not based on the emotional weight of one person's claims. If we're going to proceed, we must do it with fairness." The flight attendants, still visibly rattled, exchanged looks. The Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the lawyer raised a hand. "Ma'am, your accusations are serious, but they are also unsubstantiated. We have a responsibility to treat both parties equally. The facts will speak for themselves." Nia stood taller as the room grew silent. The weight of the moment was both suffocating and empowering. She was no longer just a passenger on a flight. She was standing in front of an audience, demanding that the truth be heard. The Karen was momentarily taken aback, her face flushed with a mix of indignation and uncertainty. Nia could see the cracks starting to form in her narrative. The flight attendants, finally feeling some support from the lawyer's calm mediation, nodded in agreement. "We'll be landing soon," one of them said, "and we'll assess the situation accordingly. But for now, we ask that both of you stay calm and allow the crew to handle this." As the plane continued its descent into Los Angeles, the tension didn't completely dissipate, but something had shifted. The Karen's accusations were no longer the loudest voice in the room. The passengers, who had been silent spectators, now sat with a new awareness. Nia had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had taken back control of the narrative. The plane landed minutes later, and the crew was prepared to take the next steps. But Nia knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a larger battle, one that she was no longer willing to fight alone. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, the low rumble of the landing gear was drowned out by the anxious murmurs of the passengers. The flight attendants, now visibly relieved that the immediate tension was over, remained alert as the plane slowed to a stop on the tarmac. Outside, waiting by the gate, were several uniformed officers. Their presence was a chilling reminder that the situation wasn't yet over. Nia could feel the weight of the moment in the pit of her stomach. She was about to face whatever the authorities had in store, but at least she wasn't facing it alone. The lawyer from earlier had stayed by her side throughout the flight, offering quiet support and guiding her through the chaos. He was now in conversation with the airline staff, recounting the events, as well as a few other passengers who had spoken up on Nia's behalf. When the authorities boarded the plane, they quickly took control of the situation, but it wasn't long before the Karen's story began to unravel. The officers listened to the passengers who had witnessed the incident, who all corroborated Nia's version of events. The lawyer's calm demeanor and his direct questioning of the Karen only further exposed the holes in her accusations. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," the Karen stammered, her earlier bravado gone. I was scared. She was acting so hostile." But the truth had already been laid bare. The Karen's behavior had been erratic, unfounded, and racially motivated. She was escorted off the plane, her claims dismissed as the authorities turned their attention to the airline's next steps. Nia felt a rush of emotions as she watched the Karen leave the plane, but none of them were triumph. Instead, there was a deep, quiet satisfaction. Justice hadn't been swift or easy, but it had been done. Her heart was still racing, her hands still a little shaky, but she knew this moment, this fight, was one she wouldn't forget. In the days that followed, Nia received messages from several passengers who had quietly supported her during the flight. Some sent her notes of thanks, others expressed admiration for her courage. Social media platforms were flooded with posts from people who had heard her story and praised her for standing up in a tense, volatile moment. Though the messages were overwhelmingly positive, there were still some who sided with the Karen, who believed her version of events without question. The aftermath was far from over. Nia knew that the racial biases that had sparked this confrontation would still be out there, lurking in places she couldn't always see. But there was something different now. She wasn't afraid to speak out, to stand firm in her truth. In a world where justice often felt elusive, Nia understood one thing for certain. The battle wasn't over, but she was stronger for having fought it. More empowered than ever, she was ready to face whatever came next. As the days passed, Nia reflected on everything that had transpired. The adrenaline of the flight had worn off, but the impact of the incident stayed with her. She knew the system was deeply flawed. What had happened to her wasn't an isolated event, but part of a larger, deeply rooted issue that continued to thrive, often unseen or dismissed by those in power. Standing up to injustice, she realized, required more than just courage. It required persistence. But Nia wasn't alone. She had gained allies, strangers who had become advocates, who had spoken up for her and for what was right. Their support filled her with a sense of solidarity, a reminder that there were others who believed in fairness and equality. For the first time in a long while, Nia felt the strength of a community behind her, pushing her forward. While she knew this incident was just a small chapter in a much larger narrative of racial injustice, she also understood the significance of what had happened. She had faced a moment of oppression head-on and refused to back down. She had spoken out, fought back, and survived the ordeal with her dignity intact. It hadn't been easy, and it wasn't the end, but it was something. It was enough. In the end, Nia didn't just challenge the Karen or the airline's unfair treatment. She had challenged the very norms that allowed such behavior to persist. And that act of resistance, that refusal to be silenced, would resonate far beyond the confines of that airplane. For now, that was more than enough. The story of Nia's confrontation with the Karen aboard the flight is more than just a tale of one woman's fight for justice. It's a deep exploration of the complexities of racism, power dynamics, and the resilience required to face injustice head-on. Throughout the narrative, Nia grapples not only with the overt accusation and racial profiling from the Karen, but also with the emotional and psychological toll that systemic racism inflicts on those who are constantly aware of their race in spaces where they are supposed to feel equal, safe, and neutral. Nia's experience highlights how racism isn't always loud and overt. Often, it's insidious, subtle, and embedded in everyday interactions that are frequently dismissed or ignored by those who aren't affected. The Karen's outburst, which might seem like an isolated incident, is merely a manifestation of a much broader societal issue. Her false accusations, based purely on her racial bias, are a microcosm of how racial prejudice can manifest in many aspects of life, often unchecked by institutions that are supposed to protect and serve. At its core, this story is about finding one's voice. Nia's internal struggle, whether to stay quiet and avoid conflict or to speak out and face the consequences, echoes a universal truth for many marginalized groups. Silence is often a survival mechanism, but speaking out can be both an act of bravery and defiance. The story emphasizes that resilience is not just about surviving moments of injustice. It's about finding the strength to stand up, challenge the norm, and demand respect, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The ultimate message of the story is clear. The fight against systemic racism is ongoing, but every time a person speaks out, they create a ripple effect that reverberates far beyond that moment. Nia's courage may seem small in the grand scheme of things, but her willingness to stand up in the face of prejudice creates a lasting impact, encouraging others to do the same. Her journey is a testament to the power of standing up, to the importance of using one's voice, and to the undeniable strength that comes from refusing to be silenced.